So, scientists are studying the DNA molecule to try to figure out how it's put together. I gave you kind of a preview of what the parts are. We have nucleotides that are composed of sugars. You know, I drew the stop sign, kind of sugar-looking thing. We have bases attached to those. We have a phosphate group attached, and that's in DNA and in RNA. But those bases can vary. The bases can be purines or pyrimidines, so maybe it's a two box, right? Maybe that would be a purine, or a single box for a pyrimidine. And the phosphate group stays the same. And in DNA, we have an H instead of an OH on this second carbon. And this is our 3' carbon here, and this is our 5' carbon up here. Now, Rosalind Franklin, she was a scientist who used this technique called X-ray diffraction, and I'm not going to pretend to know exactly how it works other than to tell you this. She had an X-ray machine, okay? And then she would stick a test tube of like DNA right there, and then she would have film over here, and the X-rays would hit the DNA and they spread out in different ways and hit that film, and that makes a picture. And she was able to look at those pictures and do the math and figure out the structure or the basic shape of the DNA molecule by doing that. And she came to the conclusion that it was some kind of helix, some kind of spiral. Now, the next group of scientists come along and they see her picture. I think they saw it without her knowing. It's kind of an ethical issue. But they saw her picture and they went, huh, Chargaff says that purines and pyrimidines, you know, purines equal pyrimidines. So, like, for example, T always equals A in DNA, and C always equals G. And we know that there's a spiral involved. And they started modeling this in hundreds of ways to try to figure out how can we make sense of all this data to figure out how DNA works. And then one day, they got it. They built the double helix of DNA. I'm going to try to include the paper that they originally published on Blackboard on this, some videos of the double helix as well to help you see some of these things in video form. But there are lots of good videos on mastering on these topics, and I suggest you watch them. But they figure it out and they win the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, Rosalind Franklin did not win the Nobel Prize because they don't give it to you after you're dead, and she had died of cancer, probably from all the X-ray studies she had done. But here's their model. It's called the double helix, and it's composed of anti-parallel strands. So what we see here is one strand of DNA like we drew before, and here are let me give you the parts. This part we call the backbone. That's the sugar and the phosphate. So we say DNA has a sugar phosphate backbone. Okay. And then here are the bases, right? These are the bases. Now notice there's two strands of DNA here. There's two sugar phosphate backbones. There's one over here, and the 5' end is at the top, and the 3' end is at the bottom. We can pretend it's running in this direction if we say the 5' end is up, right? The one over here is running in the other direction. The 3' end is up, and the 5' end is down. It's running in the other direction. It's like I-40. One lane of traffic goes this way and one goes the other way. So it's anti-parallel. And they were able to figure out that they're held together. These two separate strands, these single strands of DNA, are held together by hydrogen bonds between the bases. Now, a hydrogen bond occurs, let me just show you how it works in water. And we have a water molecule here which consists of hydrogen, I'm sorry, I screwed that up, of oxygen and two hydrogens right here, okay? Hydrogen and a hydrogen. Now, oxygen and hydrogen form covalent bonds, but they're called polar covalent bonds because they do not share electrons equally. Polar bond, right? It's a polar covalent bond. Oxygen has a higher electronegativity, meaning it can hold on to electrons better than hydrogen. So it borrows electrons more than it shares them. And electrons have a negative charge. And so those negative electrons are hanging out with oxygen a lot, and it makes oxygen negative, and that means hydrogen in turn is a little bit positive. And that's one water molecule. Now you get another water molecule over here. Its oxygen is negative and its hydrogens are positive. And so oxygen's here. Oxygen has a negative charge. Hydrogen has a positive. They're going to form a weak bond because opposites attract. Negatives and positives attract. They form a weak bond between them called a hydrogen bond. And so that's the kind of bond. It's not in water in this case. It's between the bases. But those are the kinds of bonds we see right here between those nitrogenous bases. We call those the nitrogenous bases, the purines and pyrimidines. They're a base with a nitrogen in it. And so they form weak bonds called hydrogen bonds that hold the double helix of DNA together. So we have a helix, one side and another side held together, and that whole thing's twisted to form a double helix, and we can see those drawings here. And now we know the structure of DNA. And now scientists can start to work on how does it replicate, how does it make more DNA, and how does it direct the production of protein. Those are the next questions we would have to ask. But what we can see, just to show you once again, adenine and thymine form hydrogen bonds between this nitrogen and this hydrogen. So I would guess that this hydrogen is a little bit positive and this nitrogen is a little bit negative, for example, and we form a bond there. And same thing with cytosine and guanine. And except in cytosine and guanine, we actually have 3 hydrogen bonds, so they're a little bit stronger than the bonds between adenine and thymine. And you can see lots of drawings of this in your textbook. We draw DNA in lots of different ways, and it shows you all the different ways we can draw it. And I suggest you check those out and kind of make sense of it all. It takes work to study this stuff. You might want to draw it as much as you can, look at the book, talk out loud, explain what you're seeing as if you're teaching it, and that will help you to learn it more thoroughly. So the next thing we're going to talk about then in the next video is how DNA can replicate itself, which is something they had to be able to explain in order to understand how it could be passed from one generation